This is the Cortex Athletic Review. I'm your host, Evan Carrillo, and each week I dive into the research to distill and relate sports science and psychological peer-reviewed literature to modern-day coaching and athletic development with a slight bias to hockey goaltenders. Episode 23. Let's go to work. Consider two countries. One's got a huge population and high participation in youth sport. The other is much smaller, just a fraction of the size, yet somehow produces athletes and teams that are surprisingly competitive at the international level, even against these large countries. When that happens, people start building a kind of mythology or lore around the smaller country. There must be some kind of secret sauce, some hidden development model that's happening. I pushed back on that idea a little bit back in episode 13, talking about logarithms and population scaling effects, but I'm not going to just ignore when something consistently works also. Explorations like this will always be interesting to me because you tend to see active ingredients to athlete development models rather than just pick the best ones from this massive population. This week's article looks at elite sports systems in 4 Nordic countries, so Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, and breaks down what they actually have in common and where they start to separate. The article is called Elite Sport in Nordic Countries, a comparative analysis of Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. It was written by Klaus Nielsen Birkbeck from the University of London in the UK and Rasmus K. Storm from the Danish Institute for Sports Studies in Norway. To set this up a little bit before launching into the paper, the authors note a lot of similarities between the Nordic countries in terms of things like population density, facilities, grassroots participation, and government-supported sports systems. In all 4 countries, sport was viewed more as something for everyone than something built purely around producing elite athletes. But more and more differences are starting to appear in recent years, and we're starting to see a little bit of separation between these 4 countries. For example, Norway and Denmark moved toward more of a centralized and coordinated high-performance model, where Sweden and Finland have stayed more decentralized, meaning the responsibilities are spread across multiple organizations that don't always coordinate particularly well with each other. Not that they have anything against each other, but it's just that there's a lot of moving parts to coordinate if there's no one central governing body. Norway and Denmark have established clear leadership, performance goals, and a more direct collaboration between sports science, coaching, athlete support, as well as the national sport organizations. So with the Nordic countries, the issue isn't so much a participation problem yet. These countries all still have relatively high sport participation. The difference seems to be what happens right after that initial participation stage. In other words, it's less about getting kids into sports and more about what kind of structure exists once athletes start exploring the high performance streams. Take a second and just think about some of the variables that are tied to elite sport development. Things like coaching, facilities, stuff like that. For you as the listener, what are your top 3 variables? Here, the authors used something called the SPLIS framework. And SPLIS is just an acronym that stands for Sports Policy Factors Leading to International Sporting Success. The model evaluates elite sports systems by assessing the way they address categories like funding, coaching, talent development, facilities, sports science use, governance, and so on. Frameworks like this can miss some things, though, perhaps some of the more cultural aspects of sports systems. And in Nordic countries, this can be a big thing. So the authors of this research also discuss things like egalitarianism, nationalism, legitimacy of elite sport, and the role of the welfare state. One of the recurring themes throughout the article is that all four of these Nordic countries historically viewed sport through a very egalitarian lens. It was very much for everybody. The idea wasn't originally to create elite performers. Instead, it was just more about broad access. It was about public health and participation and getting as many members of the community involved in sport as possible. The authors even note that amateurism lasted longer in Nordic countries than in many other places. There was a pretty heavy skepticism toward professionalism and skepticism toward building systems that heavily prioritized elite athletes over everybody else. But eventually, this competition in modern international sport starts to force some decisions to be made. At some point, if you want to compete internationally, especially against those countries that are investing really heavily into like centralized high performance systems or sports science, full time coaching, targeted funding, you either adapt or you just start to fall behind. According to the paper, Norway and Denmark adapted much more aggressively. Denmark actually did it through legislation. In 1984, Denmark introduced something called the Elite Sport Act, which created Team Denmark, an independent organization specifically responsible for overseeing elite sport development. What's interesting, though, is the paper argues this wasn't initially framed as like, we need more medals. It was framed more through the lens of like general athlete welfare. The concern was that elite sport was becoming increasingly professionalized internationally at younger and younger ages. And if Danish athletes were going to participate in that environment, they needed proper support structures around them. Norway, meanwhile, took a slightly different path. They maintained more of an arm's length relationship with their government, but internally created a much more centralized performance structure around this thing called Olympiatoppen. Olympiatoppen in Norway was essentially their centralized high performance sport organization. You can think of it as a strategic hub for this Norwegian elite sport. It was created in the late 1980s after Norway realized its international performance, especially at the Olympics, was starting to slip. The paper actually points to this really disastrous 1988 Winter Olympics where Norway, of all countries, failed to win a single gold medal, and that event was viewed as a major catalyst for this Olympiatoppen to be formed. As the paper progresses, it continuously circles back to this Olympiatoppen organization. And it becomes one of the major focal points of this paper because the authors repeatedly point to it as one of the defining characteristics of the Norwegian model. Not just because it centralizes the resources, but because it centralizes learning. Coaches, sports scientists, researchers, and different sport organizations were all interacting with each other much more consistently. Sports were no longer hanging out in these silos by themselves. Knowledge developed in one sport could very easily and often did transfer over to another sport. The paper gives examples like altitude training knowledge, ski preparation, and performance science spreading across multiple sports rather than just staying isolated inside one single federation. The authors describe this as moving from more of a fragmented network into more of a collaborative cluster. And it's a really interesting idea because, like, I just think about us in the hockey world and even positionally sometimes the goalie people don't always do a great job of talking with the forward and the defensive people and vice versa. Not to mention, I honestly can't remember ever having a conversation with a single baseball coach or like a back catching coach or anything like that. So this is a really intriguing idea. I don't know what this Olympiatoppen would actually look like in Norway. Norway's always kind of been on my bucket list for countries to visit, and now that I know about this, it would be interesting to pop into an Olympiatoppen facility. It is actually physically located really close to the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences. The authors do note that Olympiatoppen was not initially a really smooth introduction There was political conflict, there was organizational tension as they were figuring things out. There's even turf wars and personality clashes like you would get anywhere. So it wasn't a perfectly smooth system, and I believe it is still not a perfectly smooth system. But despite these tensions, the centralized structure certainly created more effective learning and coordination. Personally, I think going to an institution like this would be an absolute dream job. Sports science research and collaborating with other sports science researchers across different domains, that would be an absolute dream job. One thing that the paper keeps coming back to kind of over and over again and keeps revisiting is that these systems did not just randomly end up the way they are now. The authors actually repeatedly describe the development of these systems as something called path dependent, which is basically the idea that once a system starts moving in a certain direction and gains some momentum, it becomes increasingly difficult to suddenly change course later on. Maybe there's a little bit of sunk cost fallacy playing on here, but that's typically the way that a lot of things tend to go. Earlier decisions, cultural values, funding structures, governance models, even attitudes toward elite sport itself, they all start to layer on top of each other over the decades and become increasingly rigid and more difficult to change or tweak. So, for example, if a country historically prioritizes really broad participation, lots and lots of participation, as well as things like local autonomy and equal distribution of resources, eventually you build organizations, expectations, and political structures around those very ideas. Coaches start to get used to operating independently. Federations become really protective of their autonomy, and funding systems become tied to participation numbers rather than medal potential. Decision making becomes decentralized because culturally that just feels more acceptable and safer and fair. Then later, if international sport becomes more professionalized and more centralized globally, all of a sudden you're trying to compete in a completely different environment, but with a system that was not originally designed for that purpose. Up and changing that system is not going to be easy because you're no longer just changing policies, you're changing the very identity of the system. At the same time that a lot of these countries were getting more fixed and rigid with their systems, other countries like Norway and Denmark here were slowly starting to move toward these centralized high performance structures. So, over time, what tends to happen with these slow builds as these advantages start to compound? This might have a snowball effect of some sorts. So, better coordination improves knowledge sharing, and knowledge sharing improves coaching, and coaching improves performance, and better performance increases legitimacy and funding. So, the gap between systems doesn't necessarily appear overnight. It kind of widens gradually over this accumulation and compounding. And the paper argues that this is part of why Sweden and Finland can recognize many of the same problems and even understand what needs to improve, but they still struggle with any actual implementation of these major changes. There's just too much inertia taking them down a different path. Historically, Sweden was actually the most successful Nordic country internationally, anyways. The paper points out sustained success in sports like hockey, for sure, as I'm very familiar with, football, handball, skiing, tennis, golf. So, this isn't a country with no sporting tradition or no infrastructure by any means. But according to the authors, Sweden's system becomes increasingly difficult to coordinate effectively because these responsibilities were just spread so far between multiple organizations that just never spoke or never talked to each other. The Swedish Sports Confederation oversees large portions of sport development, while the Swedish Olympic Committee also runs high performance programs, talent initiatives, and Olympic preparation. The problem is, these organizations don't really work together smoothly. The paper even cites that interviewed stakeholders repeatedly describe the system using phrases like double command structure and lack of clarity, and even the phrase turf wars pops up once in a while. It's certainly not the case that Sweden lacks smart people. Like, they don't. There's some brilliant people there, brilliant sporting minds. There's amazing facilities. They've got a good participation rate, and they've got an absolute wealth of coaching knowledge. The issue is more that fragmented systems create this friction. Different organizations compete for influence, and priorities become unclear, and coordination becomes harder. The paper even notes that almost nobody interviewed would intentionally design the Swedish system the way that it currently exists if they were starting from scratch today. Finland has experienced similar fragmentation, but for somewhat different historical reasons. Finland historically had really strong divisions between worker sport organizations and more of these bougie, they're called bourgeois sport organizations. And although those divisions have faded over time, the system apparently still remained organizationally complex and kind of unstable. So the paper describes periods of financial collapse and governance confusion, weak coordination, and eventually increasing state intervention that comes in later and tries to stabilize things. One of the major blows came after the Finnish doping scandal in Nordic skiing in the early 2000s, which the authors say damaged legitimacy and dried up private sponsorship funding for years afterward. So again, what's interesting is the paper isn't framing this as Finnish athletes suddenly became worse. That's not it at all. It's framing it more as systemic instability. In fact, one thing the authors emphasize multiple times is that Finland still has really good facilities, really strong participation, and quite highly developed sport institutes and academies, very similar to Sweden. Obviously, infrastructure alone does not automatically create elite performance. You can have the shiniest stainless of steel buildings out there, and without proper infrastructure and proper governance and good development frameworks, it's kind of useless. If the organizations around that infrastructure are not aligned, the efficiency of that system is going to be quite low. It's going to be poor. It's going to break down. This is where the paper starts to lean heavily into the idea that organization itself may be a performance variable. It's not simply just the talent that comes through the door, and it's not simply the dollars that are available, and it's definitely not just the facilities that are there. The authors are making the point it's how effectively the entire system communicates, coordinates, and learns. And this system, again, it's not just within a specific sport. This one is actually spanning across different sports. That might be one of the more intellectually interesting parts of this paper is this weird kind of tension it identifies between these egalitarian values and elite performance systems. Many of the same cultural values that helped build these incredibly strong grassroots sport cultures in Nordic countries can also make certain aspects of elite sport reform a lot more difficult. I'll try and explain what I mean by that. So historically, these systems emphasized really broad access and equal opportunity, local autonomy, and participation for all, this egalitarian viewpoint. Now, don't get me wrong, these values definitely created some real strengths. You got high participation rates and strong sport club systems, widespread access to facilities, and strong athlete welfare structures. But modern elite sport also rewards things like centralization and targeted investment and selectivity. This can no doubt create tension inside systems that were originally built around broader egalitarian principles, because eventually elite sports starts forcing uncomfortable decisions. Which athletes are showing the most promise and should receive disproportionate resources? Or which sports get more targeted for investment? And which federations should be prioritized? Once international sport becomes increasingly professionalized and competitive, systems that are unwilling to make these tough decisions aggressively may gradually lose ground internationally. The paper points out that both Norway and Denmark became much more selective over time in how they distributed elite sport support. Funding became increasingly tied to medal potential and international competitiveness rather than just simply participation numbers. And at the grassroots or amateur levels, that could be a little bit tough to stomach. The authors repeatedly acknowledge that these Nordic systems still produce lots of strength specifically because of these strong cultural foundations, because of these high participation, strong club, public access to facilities, emphasis on athlete well-being, so on and so forth. Those things are hugely important. And actually, one of the really interesting arguments throughout the paper is that countries like Norway and Denmark did not completely abandon those welfare state values. They more adapted their elite sport around them. So instead of purely chasing medals at all costs, they were tied to build systems that could still support athlete education and long-term well-being, family life, alongside this performance. This is probably why the authors repeatedly emphasize legitimacy throughout the paper. As a sport organization, you kind of have to continue to prove your legitimacy and your value. Elite sports systems don't just need to function operationally, they also need cultural and political support from the society around them. And that legitimacy apparently differs quite a bit across these four Nordic countries. The paper describes Norway as having relatively high public enthusiasm and a lot of public support for elite sports success. Whereas Sweden, it's described as a little bit different. It's described as having a much more restrained relationship with nationalism and elite performance. The authors even use this phrase, lagom nationalism, which is kind of a funny and interesting phrase. And it's basically the idea that international success matters, just not too much. Even as an athletic development guy, I think that's sort of funny, and on a weird level, I kind of agree with it too. By the end of the paper, the authors argue the Nordic countries are actually beginning to converge somewhat on these ideals. So Sweden and Finland have both started moving toward greater coordination and clear performance goals and collaboration structures. That's been partially influenced by the relative success of Norway and Denmark. But because these systems are path dependent, those transitions are still going to be kind of slow and complicated and clunky. You're not just changing policy at that point, you're changing incentives and expectations and cultural attitudes and zeitgeists. And these are all things that have developed over decades. I think there's a bit of a lesson to be had here beyond Olympic sport. I don't think this paper proves that there's some magical Nordic athlete development secret, but I do think it highlights something else important. Elite performance environments seem to depend heavily on alignment, and not just within sport, but across different sports. So alignment of coaching, alignment of leadership, alignment of goals and communication and learning. And I think that idea scales downward too. Even locally, fragmented environments create friction. Even within a single minor hockey association or a soccer association, if there's no shared identity, no shared communication or purpose, you're just sort of hoping for some good one-off seasons here and there. These aligned systems tend to compound over time, as was shown, and I'd call that one of the real takeaways from this paper. Not that one country just found some secret formula, but that systems themselves matter more than we sometimes care to admit. That finally does it for this week's episode. That one ended up being a little bit longer than I thought, but I just thought it was a really interesting bunch of points that were made that I just never really thought of before. This integration across different sports within a local environment. I think that's a really interesting idea and something worth exploring. You can find this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. New episodes are uploaded every week on Thursday at 6 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. You can also find these on YouTube at the channel Cortex Goaltender Development. If you would like to support the show, which is currently a one-man operation that does have some costs involved with it, you can head over to patreon.com/Cortex Athletic Review. A huge thank you again to those of you who are supporters of the show. There's some contact information in the show notes and the description. Feel free to check it out. I hope this episode was useful and or interesting for you. My name is Evan Carrillo. This is the Cortex Athletic Review. Thanks for listening and stay out of your own way.